Welcome to Capitol View on WSIU. I'm Brian Sapp. The Illinois General Assembly wrapped up their fall veto session with some late-night passage of bills tackling energy policy, transportation, lots of stuff just last week. And so we're going to talk about that today. And then also the Trump administration continues their immigration enforcement in Chicago, and the deadline for filing petitions for candidates passed, and so those are locked in for right now. We have covered these topics today with Mawa Iqbal from WBEZ and Brenden Moore of Capital News Illinois. Mawa and Brenden, it's great to see you guys. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Good to be with you, Brian.
So let's start. It was a busy week. Brenden, you said that as we were recording that it was a lot of time in the State House. Being a state reporter, you guys are used to that, but there were some late nights. Let's start with transit. That was one of the big issues. There was a transit cliff, funding for particularly the Chicagoland area, the collar counties with all the transportation authorities. They were looking at some big deficits. What was what did the legislature get worked out?
Yeah, Brian, the joke was that they could do nothing or everything in the veto session, and they certainly opted for the latter. The biggest thing I would argue is this massive transit reform and funding bill that had eluded them in the spring. They, as you said, they were going to go over a fiscal cliff that was slated to grow to about $800 million by 2027. So this would have been pretty disastrous for Chicago area public transit agencies. So we're thinking CTA, PACE, Metra would have had to institute some pretty severe service cuts, lay a lot of people off. It was viewed as kind of an unacceptable option for legislators. The problem, though, was figuring out how do you pay for the needed funding for transit. They were looking to put together a package of about $1.5 billion. The Senate passed a bill in May, and the House put together a proposal early last week that would have instituted a series of tax increases on, say, deliveries from like Amazon or Uber Eats. And then last week, the House suggested perhaps a streaming tax and all these taxes that would have hit people quite a bit. But what they ultimately landed on doesn't really hit people too bad. The majority of this new funding is going to come from essentially from what we know as the road fund, but it is the transportation fund of the state. And that's going to come through the diverting sales tax from gasoline sales strictly to transit. And on top of that, in the Chicago area, there'll be a slight sales tax increase. And they're also going to use some interest generated from the road fund, which is a massive fund. So that'll generate about $200 million. So altogether, it's not going to hit people too bad. There is going to be an increase on the Illinois tollway, on the tolls that people pay, and that's going to go towards road projects for the most part. So, but altogether, it doesn't hit people too badly in the pocketbook, but it will allow for what advocates are saying is transformational investments in public transportation in Illinois, especially in the Chicago region, but also for downstate. Downstate gets some money from this as well. They're going to get about $129 million annually for operating expenses. Not as much as folks down here wanted. They initially were hoping to get about $200 million, but there is kind of a promise that there will be more money coming for projects. And there was money in there for long desired projects such as a rail connection between Chicago and the Quad Cities. So that was a huge thing for downstate. But yeah, it's a huge bill. There's a lot of provisions in there. There's a lot of stuff that goes into the governance structure of the Chicago area transit agencies. It allows it transforms the Regional Transportation Authority into the Northern Illinois Transit Agency. Basically, it gives them more power to set fares and to there'll be a universal fare system now across the system. Anybody that's taken transit in Chicago knows that the CTA is a little bit different from Metra and from
Hmm.
Pace. And it's supposed to make things a little bit easier for users of transit. So there's still a lot that we have to kind of unpack from this bill, but the highlights though are that there's going to be this new dedicated stream of funding for transit, and it'll stave off cuts and will allow for some of these bigger investments in the system.
Yeah, it's an interesting, moment, right? So I was in Peoria, for the whole latter half of the veto session. And I came back just for the last day and I thought, oh, it's the last day, like what are they gonna do? Right. And like what Brenden said, that it's very much ended up being the case that they did everything, right?
Hmm.
And medical aid in dying was one of those bills that we were not really expecting to come up. So like Brenden said, transit was probably the biggest bill that we were expecting the lawmakers to tackle. We also knew that they were going to pass an energy related package, so like trying to increase the electrical grid reliability after a summer of people facing high utility costs. But with this medical aid in dying bill, like this is something that specific groups and lawmakers have been pushing for like the past few years, I feel. And it passed, late at night, at like 2, 3 in the morning. um, and essentially what it does is, supporters call it the Dignity in Dying Act. So essentially it's if you're someone who has a terminal illness or a prognosis that's like 6 months or less, then you can actually request for a medicine or a drug that will induce your death. And obviously there's all these kind of stipulations involved with the bill. So it's not just like anyone can do it,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
It's people who have a specific prognosis, right? So like it's known that you are going to pass away, but you're in a lot of pain, so you want to do that sooner. There's also provisions that say that a doctor has to ask you multiple times, like, are you sure you want to do this? And you have to give your express consent multiple times. It's also, and this is, I think, a trickier part where I think a lot of opponents of the bill were worried that people would be coerced into taking this action by caretakers who might feel like, oh, that this person who I've been taking care of is a liability, and I'm just kind of done taking care of them. So yeah, you should take this drug, right? Um, and I guess the way the lawmakers have tried sort of legislating that more tricky aspect is to include a provision that would essentially make it so that, the person has their full like mental capacities.
Hmm.
So it's obviously someone who has like a developmental disability or like that they would be exempt from this. And so it's very controversial, and I think that that's definitely contributed to why it's taken so long to pass this bill. I mean, you have a lot of religious groups, particularly Catholic groups, that were like lobbying very, very hardcore against it, saying, which I think is similar to their stance on abortion, is we don't support anything that will bring on the death of a person, right? You also actually had this group called Access Living, who advocates for people with developmental and physical disabilities, who are very much hardcore against it as well, saying that, this is going to put people who have disabilities in a very precarious situation where they, again, feel coerced by a caretaker or a guardian or a family member to take an action that maybe they wouldn't have taken otherwise. So it'll be interesting to see, right, if Governor Pritzker does sign it, it would be quite historic. Um, but we at WBEZ, we've been covering this bill for quite some time, and some of my colleagues have written about people who have personally experienced this, right? So people who either were caring for someone who was, on the brink of dying, and then or someone who is actually like on the brink of dying and says that they would love to have this option just because, the person describes all the pain that they're under, right? And how sometimes it just gets to be too much to bear. So it'll be interesting to see, I think, what ends up happening.
It is a challenging topic, and it's obviously one that we've seen lots of emotions on, and we'll have to wait for the governor's signature or veto on that. You brought up energy was the other big bill that happened. We've been waiting on that. That was one big things expected from the spring session didn't happen. Sounds like they came to an agreement. Brenden, can you kind of walk us through where we're at now, what we were able to get figured out?
Yeah, lawmakers passed a pretty big energy bill that addresses kind of twin concerns. So anybody that got a electric bill this summer was really feeling it. Rates increased pretty dramatically, and maybe not as seen, but just as important is, the state passed legislation a few years ago aiming to get to 100% clean energy generation by 2050. And quite frankly, we're behind. There's just not enough wind and solar projects coming on the grid to replace what's coming off the grid in terms of coal and natural gas and some of these other sources of power. So legislators were really keen to get something done to address those issues. The big item in this bill is incentivizing battery storage. So these projects, these batteries basically would store the energy generated from wind and solar so that it can be used when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, and kind of addressing that issue of, it being an intermittent power source, and addressing that base load power issue. So this incentive program would be funded by ratepayers. So folks are going to pay a little bit more in the short term, but advocates say that it will pay for itself in the long term within the next 5 years, and that it will dramatically increase capacity and relieve the grid of some of this increased demand that we've seen. A lot of it coming from some of these data centers that have really risen with the rise of artificial intelligence. There are a lot of other provisions in there too. Another one that's worth noting is that it lifts the state's moratorium on the development of large nuclear reactors. The state had lawmakers passed, and Governor Pritzker signed a bill a few years ago that allowed for micronuclear. But that really hasn't taken off. There are some questions about the economics of it. But this would at least clear the way. And again, because nuclear development, it takes years and years and years and a lot of approvals to get that type of project off the ground. But this would at least clear the path for that if that was something that the state wanted to do. There are other provisions in there that have to do with energy efficiency. There's some stuff with giving the Illinois Commerce Commission some more authority to do some integrated resource planning, which hasn't really been a thing since Illinois deregulated its energy market a few decades ago. It's really trying to address some of these issues that have come up in the years since the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act passed, and basically acknowledging that the energy space is shifting pretty quick, and lawmakers had to address that. They think they did. Critics say that it's just raising prices for customers in the short term with no promise that it'll lead to lower rates in the long term. And that's probably the rub of it, that there's really nothing that they could have done in this session to lower folks' bills tomorrow. But advocates at least say that, we have to start here if we want to get there eventually, whether it is a few years from now or next year or whatever it may be.
Yeah, like Brendan was saying, it's definitely a time issue, right? Like I do remember when they passed CEJA, I think it was in
Mhm.
2021, maybe. And they had set these goals, these deadlines for being carbon neutral by 2050, and then for having 1 million electric vehicles on the road on Illinois roads by 2030. And we just had WBEZ just had an expert like that on our one of our talk shows talk about like where is the state when it comes to EVs and how many EVs are on the road, and we're not doing so well.
Mm.
Unfortunately for the state, right? Like there's 5 years left, and of course, like with the Trump administration coming in and like getting rid of all these EV rebates for people wanting to buy EVs and incentivize the purchase of EVs, like that's obviously going to make it a lot more difficult for the state to achieve their climate goals, right? But it's interesting, like what Brendan was bringing up, that like they had these big goals, and it seems like we have all this time, but they also have to get moving on some of this stuff too, because it does take a while to find renewable sources of energy and to find ways to not put more stress on this grid now that we have data centers also competing against those goals too.
Yeah, as you were saying that, I was like, it just the constant state of change, technology, then you throw in data centers and you have to build in the infrastructure. Yeah, they've got a tall task, and we all saw our bills go up this year, and that's the hard thing when people are having to make ends meet. So we'll have to see if they have to make any changes or start getting these new resources online. Had one more topic that the legislature addressed, and it's kind of lead us into immigration, what's happening in Chicago. They passed, as you said, a suite of bills, a package of bills talking about immigration. One of the big things was preventing arrests at state courthouses. Mawa, I'm going to start with you on that. What did this package of bills do, and what do they hope it addresses, and will it stand up in court? That's one of the kind of questions I've seen.
This package of bills is definitely something that I know, at least from the members of the Latino caucus, those lawmakers who are from the Chicagoland area who represent communities with like high populations of Latino Hispanic people, have said even before veto session, like when we were seeing all this escalated immigration enforcement in the Chicagoland area, we're seeing clashes between protesters and ICE agents getting more and more violent. Now, of course, we have Gregory Bovino, who's with Customs and Border Protection, who's facing a court. He's in court now, and it's just it's gotten to be such a big issue, and a lot of lawmakers from this area were like, okay, what is our capacity as state lawmakers to address this federal issue, right? Like what's within our jurisdiction? And they came to veto, and they passed this package, which basically does a lot of things, but the most noteworthy thing I would say is the fact that or what would be allowing private citizens to take civil action against an ICE agent if they feel like their constitutional rights have been violated while that ICE agent was enforcing immigration. So this could be something like, the ICE agent is refusing to identify themselves because they're wearing a face mask, and they won't identify themselves while they're making an arrest, or they're driving around in a car that doesn't have a license plate, or the license plate is altered. So it's really interesting because since this would be a state law, the private citizen would sue the ICE agent in state court. However, when I talked to Senate President Don Harmon, who was pushing the bill, he said that there is a very likely chance that the case does get kicked up to the federal court system. And when it's in the federal court system, then it's more up in the air on like how the civil or how the citizen will fare, right? Like how their lawsuit will fare. Because basically what he was saying was, if it gets kicked up through the federal courts, it could eventually land in the U.S. Supreme Court. And as we know, we have a more conservative bench at the moment. And, there's a chance that they might want to rule in more in favor, more in line with the Trump administration. Or, like what Senate President Harman was saying, that there's a chance that if it does get kicked in the federal court system, that like the federal government can stand in for the agent and actually be the defendant in the case, right? And so he was saying that they could do a lot of things, right? But what he told me was he just wanted to give people an option or some kind of recourse. He was like, that just because like XYZ can happen doesn't mean that we still can't try our very best. Of course, a lot of Republican lawmakers, including Senate Minority Leader John Curran, were saying that, this is not going to hold up in U.S. Supreme Court. Like this violates federalism principles, which is this idea that state and federal jurisdictions are separate. And so what we'll see, I mean, like, this wouldn't be the first time that the Democrats have passed something where it's unclear whether it will hold up in court, but they pass it anyways. And they're like, we'll just let the courts figure it out. But I think definitely, certainly in this moment, it's such a intense and emotional and raw moment for a lot of lawmakers. And just, like during the debate, the floor debate of this bill, right? Like many of the Latino lawmakers, Latino caucus lawmakers were delivering their floor remarks and just talking about what it's been like for them personally and how they're living in fear. Their constituents are being kidnapped and they have to hear helicopters whirring over their heads at 4 a.m. And like kids are being, kids are scared to go to school. Their elementary schools, like, there's ICE agents like tear gassing the area outside elementary schools. Like, so just all these like horrific things that have been happening. It's a very raw moment for them. But yeah, like you said too, the one other aspect of the bill is that, it creates a 1,000-foot bubble zone around courthouses. So like ICE agents are not allowed to make civil arrests outside courthouses now, which is a huge deal, right? Because of course we were hearing from not only Chicago, but other places around the country that ICE agents would just kind of show up to people's like immigration hearings and detain them. There's also, another provision that would direct hospitals, healthcare facilities, higher ed institutions, and daycares to create a policy on like how to deal with ICE agents trying to come in and make arrests. So it does a lot of things, and yeah, it seems very likely that Governor Pritzker will sign this bill into law. I guess we'll just see what happens with the court's legal battle of it.
Brenden, you also covered this. Was there anything that kind of stuck out with you, maybe on the effectiveness of this and kind of tackling these issues that Mawa said that the Latino community is facing?
Yeah, I mean, Mawa hit most of the big points on the head, but what I'll really highlight though, and again, Mawa spoke to it a bit, that there's a real palpable anger among state lawmakers, especially Democrats who represent these districts where a lot of this ICE activity is happening. I mean, State Rep Han Win, for instance, represents the north side of Chicago. He said that he literally had a gun pulled on him by a Border Patrol agent. And then you have lawmakers that, State Senator Selena Villanueva talking about, ICE activity right outside of her office, right near the high school in the community she represents, which is Little Village. And so they really wanted to do something more than just platitudes, more than just words on paper to respond. But as Mawa said, they're very limited in what they can do because this ultimately is kind of a state versus federal issue. So they did the protections in state and county courthouses. We saw last week just in Southern Illinois, a man in Clinton County was detained, he was going to a hearing for a DUI case. He's been in the country for more than 2 decades, was trying to do the right thing, go to court, and ICE picked him up. So this would look to prevent situations like that, which, again, historically wasn't necessarily in law, but it was just kind of understood that you don't go to a place like a courthouse or a hospital or a daycare and pick people up or I guess try to get information about people, but that's kind of gone out the window. So state lawmakers responded to try to codify some of what had previously been standard practice. Again, the private right of action, it looks very difficult for that to have pass legal muster. I mean, Senate President Harman basically said as much, that it's going to be challenged. He's a lawyer; he understands that. But this was, I think, more of a visceral reaction that we have to do something, even if it doesn't stand up in a courtroom. They feel like they have to prove to their constituents that they are responding, and they're trying to do something at the very least.
Yeah, definitely. It's trying to figure out this system of federalism that we have and figure out how to meet the needs and what everybody needs for themselves. Well, thank you for joining us. That's it for this week's Capitol View. Join us next week as we look what's making news around the state of Illinois.